Meredith to our program. She's going to talk about Minnesota's coldwater hatcheries and some of the great work that our hatchery system does to keep some of these great, what do we have, 200 miles, 200 lakes and over 100 streams we stock in the state of Minnesota. So there's a lot of fish stocking that happens. So we're going to cover that today. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to Meredith.
Welcome. Welcome to Minnesota's Coldwater Hatcheries. I happen to work at Spire Valley Hatchery. It is in central Minnesota, about an hour north of Brainerd and about an hour southwest of Grand Rapids. We are the smallest of all of our coldwater hatcheries, and yet we manage to produce lots and lots of fish. So this front screen is kind of fun because it has all the fish that we raise on here, which are brown trout, brook trout, lake trout, splake, rainbow trout, and steelhead, which is also a rainbow trout, but it acts just a little different. So these are the coldwater hatcheries that we have in Minnesota. Like I said, I'm in Spire Valley, which is in central Minnesota. And then we have 3 large coldwater hatcheries that are down in the southeast: Crystal Springs Hatchery, Lanesboro Hatchery, and Peterson Hatchery. We also have 12 warm and cool water hatcheries throughout the state. They are seasonal, which means that unlike our cold water hatcheries, they do not run year round, and those do muskie, walleye, and some catfish production, and there might be a couple others in there that they raise that I missed, because with cold water hatchery, that pretty much takes up all of my time. So here's a little snapshot of our different hatcheries. This is Lanesboro Fish Hatchery. They are about 97 years old, and this hatchery is kind of cool because it started out as a mill, and then they converted it into a hatchery. It's kind of gone through a few different iterations during its history because they've had to fix things and repair things and upgrade things. They are raising rainbow trout and brown trout, and they most recently redid a huge construction project on the office and the nursery, and that ran from 2020 to 2021. This is Peterson Hatchery. It's about 83 years old because they raised fish here before the DNR raised fish, and the DNR has owned it for about 35 years. This hatchery is kind of unique because of all of our hatcheries, it is the only one that has these very large, round, domed tanks that they raise most of their fish in, which is ideal for the lake trout that they raise because the lake trout are very happy in dark conditions. They also have brook trout, and they have splake, which is a cross between a lake trout and a brook trout, which is convenient because they have both there. And Peterson has gone through many small improvements that have been made over the years, which includes both changing from ponds to their large dome tanks, and also just small little projects like making it easier to calculate how much water they have in something like the nursery that's shown here. Crystal Springs Hatchery is 82 years old. This one has had a bunch of different repairs throughout the years, and I believe the Civilian Conservation Corps was actually involved with this one at one point as well. They raise brook trout, steelhead, and rainbow trout. The rainbow trout are actually in their own little pond, so on site they have brook trout and rainbow trout. They are near Whitewater State Park, which makes them pretty popular. And this hatchery has been aging for quite a while, and it is definitely in need of some major repairs, especially to things like the water lines. And then this is us, Spire Valley Hatchery. We are about 77 years old. This hatchery has raised just about every single cold water species there is. And it also used to be a bait fish hatchery. The DNR has owned this place for about 55 years, and it has been exclusively cold water since the DNR has owned it. Currently, we are raising rainbow trout and steelhead. And our facilities are old. They could definitely use some repairs, although we managed to do pretty well for what we have. So I know there's been a lot of talk about the upcoming funding that's with the stuff that's going through the legislature. We are asking for $60 million, and that will be used for repairs and upgrades to not just the cold water hatcheries, but also some of the warmer cool water hatcheries. And that goes towards upgrading things, repairing things, and just keeping everything in good working order so that we can continue to raise the fish that we do. So a little bit about the fish. We have several different sizes that they get released at. There are the fry, which are the smallest. Sometimes they're on feed, sometimes they haven't been on feed. Fingerlings, which are probably about 6 to 7 inches long. And then the yearlings, which are between 9 and 11 inches long. And we also do stock some adult fish. Those fish are not raised for stocking specifically, but because within the cold water hatchery system, we have to have adults on hand so that we can continue to produce the regular fish that we stock. Those adults eventually need to go somewhere when we're done using them, and so they get stocked around the state as surplus. And those can be anywhere from 12 inches to probably 20 some inches, depending on which species you have. The lake trout are about 8 to 10 years old, so they get pretty big. We have different types of rearing systems. So the raceways are pretty popular. We have raceways in just about every single hatchery. We also use a lot of tanks, and those tanks come in rectangular, square, semi-square, circular. It just depends on the system as to what shape of tank that we're using. A lot of times the tanks are smaller fish, but they're also used quite frequently for big fish in the case of especially Peterson. And then we use ponds. Ponds are really nice for growing out fish, for finishing fish just before we stock them. And we can just raise a lot of fish with not as much water in a pond. So that's a really nice option for us. The one drawback, if we weren't on cold spring water, which fortunately we are, would be that those ponds could get too warm for the trout. But most of our hatcheries are either well water or spring water. So we've been pretty successful in keeping that water nice and cold. So when it comes to stocking, we have several different stocking vehicles. We have the small trucks with tanks on them that are usually around 125 gallons each. So that's 300, no, I can't do math today. Small trucks with those smaller tanks, 250 gallons. And then we have larger trucks. We actually have a truck between the two sizes shown here. So it's basically a box truck that has tanks on it, or a flatbed truck that has tanks on it. And then we have the semi truck. We don't actually drive the semi truck ourselves. We own that trailer, and then we contract someone to haul that around. And we also have a special program with mostly our brook trout fingerlings, but also a few of our rainbow trout fingerlings, where they get stocked by either airplane or helicopter. That depends on what is available. And the situation with those fish is that they are getting stocked either in the boundary waters, in the case of the brook trout, or outside the boundary waters, but in lakes that are very hard to access in the case of the rainbow trout. And in order to efficiently stock those lakes without using a canoe and a whole bunch of buckets is just to airdrop them from an airplane or a helicopter. It's also why those fish have to be fairly small, because otherwise they will not successfully nosedive into the lake. So, as Benji mentioned earlier, we stock about 200 lakes, and this map is one that I pulled up off of our recent stocking lists that shows roughly the distribution of those lakes. And then 100 streams. I did not attempt that one because a lot of times we can stock one stream in several different locations, and those can be challenging to chase down if you're just using computer technology. So there are 100 streams that get stocked. And then that bottom picture is looking at Taylor Lake up by Aiken, actually, as we're stocking it off of the back of the truck. And we have a very kind landowner who lets us use their property to access that lake. So the way we get more fish, Most of them are eggs from adults on site, and our program does differ from the cool and warm water programs that way because we have to have our own broodstock on site instead of going out and catching it for the most part. There are a few situations right now where we are taking eggs from the wild as well. And that is the current strain of lake trout, the strain of brook trout, which is called Minnesota driftless. Those are coming from the streams in the southeast. And we're establishing that. And then we are still taking eggs from the steelhead up on the North Shore to keep that program going. In most of these cases, we are also establishing our own in-hatchery brood line so that we have all those adults on hand, which is good because if you get a disease out in the wild where we can't use those fish and we can't bring them into our hatcheries because we have frequent disease testing to make sure that our fish are clean and our eggs are coming from a clean source, then it would be difficult for us to go back to the wild for a few years and get those eggs. So that's why we also have our adults on hand so that we can continue to raise and stock those production fish for fishing opportunities. Egg takes happen anywhere from fall to midwinter, which is when our Kamloops rainbow trout are spawning. And so we take the number of eggs we need. We also take a bunch of eggs so that we can create the next year of adult fish that we will have on hand until they're ready to spawn. And we raise those from eggs to whatever size we need for stocking, whether it's fry, fingerling, or yearwing. And then any adults that we don't need, those are the ones that get stocked as surplus all around the state. So for anyone who wants to take a tour of our hatcheries, the link is at the top, and I know that that was going to get dropped in the chat as well. Lanesboro and Peterson offer self-guided tours. They are open from 7 to 3 o'clock, and all of our hatcheries do have gates. So if the gate is closed, please respect that and stay outside. Crystal Springs is by appointment only. Hopefully they will be doing a lot of construction coming up here. So construction generally, it means no tours just because our staff are very busy and because there can be hazardous conditions that we don't want people to run into. There's the contact number for it. And then with Spire Valley, we do take drop-in appointments as long as the staff is available, or you can also set up an appointment for a time that we can make ourselves available. And we start work here just a little bit later. That's all I have. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, or maybe not.
Yeah, to get over to my Q&A here. Thank you for that presentation. It's great. There's a lot of really cool stuff, and there's a lot of science behind these fisheries, across the country. It's not just Minnesota that does this. It's all over the place. And you guys do some phenomenal work with what you have. So Mary put in the Q&A, how do you keep the water cold in the summer in the larger outdoor ponds?
Shear volume. So when we start up one of our ponds, we start with about 125 gallons per minute going into there from a cold creek and a cold spring. So that's all spring fed. And then we start that in June, and then around July, that water's getting really warm. So then we have to add another 95 gallons a minute from one of our wells. And we do monitor that water daily just to make sure that it's not getting too warm. And we'll also put in those little fountain looking things, which are aerators, to add extra air to that water, which helps too. But usually just by adding more water, those ponds turn over fast enough, which means that the water is leaving them fast enough that they stay pretty cold.
Yeah, and you mentioned oxygen too. That cold water holds a lot more oxygen than the warm water can. So
It does.
having those aerators and stuff definitely helps. So Jeff was on the spot here with a quick question. Why are most of the cold water hatcheries in southeast Minnesota?
Because that's where there's a lot of spring water. It's all of our hatcheries. So Spire Valley Hatchery is the only hatchery that has wells. Everywhere else is all on spring water because they have very large springs down there that they've been able to use to give them water. And most of these hatcheries were not built by the DNR. They were acquired by the DNR on places that were already utilizing that spring water.
Yeah, that cursed construction provides a lot of cold, clean water down there. So, and you mentioned disease a little bit, and I had a question about, this is, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago. The one, oh, now I forget the name of it, outside of Whitewater there, was it BKD? They got a disease in that hatchery and had to shut that down and flush that out.
I
So,
think it was either gill disease or cold water disease. I'm not entirely sure because we do see a bunch of BKD, not outbreaks, but at the DNA level, because our pathology lab can now test at the DNA level. So we'll see carriers for that. We don't actually have the outbreaks, and there are medications that we can use to help mitigate that. And a lot of the waters that we stock have already been tested, and they know that it naturally occurs there. And so by Minnesota statute, if we have something that shows that it could be carrying BKD, it can be stocked into that water that already has BKD if we know it's there. As far as what happened at Crystal Springs, that disease started in one of the fish, and it was unfortunately just moved all over the hatchery. So the decision was made to kill everything in the hatchery and disinfect everything and just start over so that they weren't constantly fighting this disease, because there was not a good way to eradicate it otherwise.
yeah. Which the whole point was, I didn't realize until that happened and I was involved in that, in a different position, but in the hatchery world a little bit. Um, the importance of when something like that happens of having these different hatcheries. If we just relied on one source to get our fish eggs or fish from, the trouble we could be in if something did happen or something does happen like that. So
This is why all of our hatcheries carry their own broodstock, because in other states, especially in the federal systems, you'll see these hatcheries where all their broodstock are at one hatchery, and then they send out the eggs to the other hatcheries for production. And it could be very detrimental if you get a disease like that in your broodstock hatchery.
yeah. So at the time, I was actually running the trout in the classroom program for Minnesota Trout Unlimited when that happened, and it was just kind of a last minute thing. We were supposed to get all these eggs, and then the test came back positive, and we ended up going outstate. There was like one hatchery that we could get eggs from and get them in. So I think we had 32 schools across the state that were looking for these trout eggs for that program. So, and we were able to do that, but it was an eye-opening experience for sure. So,
Yeah.
Mark was wondering, was there not a hatchery in St. Paul recently, and was it closed? So, the hatchery in St. Paul a little bit?
There is a hatchery in St. Paul. It is in the basement of either the East or West Metro office. I am not entirely sure which one
East
it is.
Metro.
East Metro. It does exist still. Don't ask me what they raised, because I would have to call the manager, who I know, and ask her what's going on with that one. I know it's still there, and I know that, as far as I know from talking to her just recently, it's not going away.
And they're a warm water hatchery, correct?
Yes.
So
I believe walleyes are one of the things they raise. I don't know if that's the only thing they raise.
I was thinking pike might be in there too, but I'm not positive either. So
That could be. They raise northern pike somewhere.
oh yeah. Mary has a question. I'm concerned that the streams in the North Shore and the Southeast are increasing in temperature and reaching the limits of some of these species. How close to temperature limits are we?
I am not the person to ask that question, because I don't work in the field. I just supply fish. I do know that we have worked with warm temperatures up on the North Shore when we stocked steelhead up there. Fortunately, steelhead that are about this big are very resilient, and so they can find those cooler pockets, and they do manage to survive for at least a while in those streams and make it out to Lake Superior. In the case of the North Shore streams, there is that whole Lake Superior thing where if it gets too warm, they could swim downstream and just go out to Lake Superior early, and then that's really nice and cold for them.
And Mary, I'd like to point you to, I think it was 2 weeks ago, Dusty Hoffman came on and did a talk about trout easements, and he touched on that a little bit. Some of the work they've done along the North Shore and trying to mitigate climate change and get trees planted so it's shading the water and stuff like that. I know Von Stuck down in the southeast they actually do temperature logging in the stream to kind of monitor how that temperature fluctuates and goes over the years. So,
And brown trout don't seem to mind the warm temperatures as much.
Yep.
Although they're still a trout, so they have their limits.
Yeah, everything has its limit, right?
Yes.
Paul was asking, how do you work to maintain or augment genetic diversity in your brook trout fisheries? I can imagine that needing to balance wild egg sources with an internal line is a delicate line to walk. In addition, do you continually monitor the genetics of all our stocking lines? And
That's a really good question.
this is something kind of new, right?
There's actually, I do know something about this, and we have some really interesting stuff going on with genetics right now. Do we genetically test our fish regularly? No, because there's only a few people in the DNR that do that, and it's very hard to get some of their time. However, as far as maintaining the genetics goes, for those of us who are creating new brood lines, we take eggs from every single fish that we spawn, and we keep a sample of those eggs because that's what creates our new brood lines, which means that we have as many genetics as possible. For fish like the lake trout that came from a Minnesota strain in the wild and the Minnesota driftless brook trout that are coming from a local source, once those lines are established about every 3 to 4 years, as long as that original source is clean of disease, they go back in and they take about 40 pairs of fish, and so they can continually add those wild gametes back into the hatchery population to help keep the genetics good. On the North Shore, they actually are working with a geneticist because they're trying to create a line of steelhead up there that are as pure as possible, considering that they came from somewhere out west to begin with. And so what they're doing is they're working with a geneticist to make sure that there's no Kamloops genes in with the steelhead genes so that they can have a steelhead strain that's free of any Kamloops genes.
A lot of interesting science going on.
Yes.
So, Jeff was wondering, does the DNR work with or partner with private hatcheries that raise trout or salmon, or do we regulate them?
We might regulate them. I think we do disease testing on them. And I think they need a permit, although I'm not the best person to ask for that. Sean Sizzler in the city, in central office, that's his job, is to work with the private hatcheries. So I can guess, I can't give you a definitive answer on it. And as far as working with them goes, not usually. If we have recently started a new strain of brook trout that is considered domestic, which just means that they're a lot easier to catch, and they also grow better in lakes, which makes the fishermen happy. So we have been working with state hatcheries in Maine and Virginia and New York to get the eggs for those so that we can start our own line here. And we have also worked with the federal hatcheries some when they shut Crystal Springs down and had to disinfect it. We got brook trout from the federal hatchery in Wisconsin for a few years just so that we could make sure that people were still getting those brook trout stocked.
That's great. I know, like for walleye and stuff, I think there's private hatcheries that raise walleye around that we buy walleye fry from. But I'm not for sure if we do on the trout side.
No, and trout are kind of hard because it's more challenging to find a source that is clean, because all of this has to go through our pathology lab and they have to approve it, and then there's Minnesota statutes that we have to follow as well. And also, if we are bringing in a different strain, there are also genetic concerns to make sure that they're not suddenly going to take over an entire portion of the stream and kick out all the fish that were already naturally or natively there.
Interesting.
I just learned that recently.
We're always learning something new. I love it. Andrew, I'm not for sure he came in to answer this question, but what is the cost per yearling rainbow trout stocked?
I couldn't tell you. And the thing is, it also depends on the hatchery. So at Crystal Springs, they might be cheaper because they just go throw some food at those every now and then. At Lanesboro, they might be a little cheaper than us because Lanesboro doesn't have to pump its water. All of their water is spring water, and they just raise so many. And then for us, the cost might be a little bit higher because we raise a lot, we don't raise as many, which means that the price per fish goes up. And we also have some of our water as well water.
Lots of variables in there.
Yeah.
Price of food and yeah, how long you
Yeah,
raise
and the
them and all
price of
that
food
stuff.
goes up and the price of transportation goes up and
Yep. Uh, Felicia, this is an interesting question. Uh, do you monitor the success rate for airplane dropped restocking versus other restocking methods?
so that is monitored, but it is monitored by the areas who are taking care of those lakes. So the areas who manage that lake, the airplane lakes would be Tower and Grand Marais and Finland, and they do go in from time to time to look and see how well they survived. In fact, any lake that is further back in the boundary waters, if you look that up on Lake Finder, there should be a stocking report as to how many fish were stocked. And then there should also be lake survey data. So if they were targeting lake or if they were targeting the brook trout or lake trout, I mean, they're pretty much just brook trout. But if they're targeting the brook trout in that survey, you might even be able to look at that and kind of get an idea of how much they're getting back. I do know that they do make it because I have heard from the people who manage those that yes, they do go in and they find them.
It's interesting. If I was going to be stocked out of an airplane, it'd be a cool way to do it.
Well, and then there's an interesting variable there too, because if those fish that make it into the lake and do well, if they don't have a lot of competition for food and they don't have a lot of predators, they could last in that lake system a long time. So you could catch a really nice fish out of there just because they're harder to get to versus say something like Courthouse Lake that we stock fish in all the time, but it gets fished out right away because it has so much fishing pressure.
Yeah. And fishing pressure plays a big part in a lot of this too. I didn't
Oh, it really
realize until
does.
I started, fly angling a little bit more, but I spent some time down in Lanesboro. My kids were at a camp down there, so I stayed down at the little city park, Sullivan Pond, which they stock down there. But people know when that pond's getting stocked somehow,
Hmm.
and the amount of people coming down there to fish in the next 2 or 3 days after a stocking is amazing. Like
Yep.
people love to come down there and do that. So,
Yep.
uh, Mary had a question about, do you stock only into lakes and streams with a historically verified records of a particular species, or do you add fish into new lakes and streams?
So I don't want to say too much about that because I don't know much the history about it. I do know that sometimes they do identify new lakes or streams that can get stocked though, especially in the case of something like a mine pit. So where I live, there's a lot of man-made lakes, which are mine pits, and they want to stock something in there because the locals insist on fishing them, which is great. And so they'll assess these and decide what is the best thing to go in there. And our mine pits are trout lakes. They have a bunch of other stuff in there because people just throw stuff in there, but officially they are managed as trout lakes. So you'll get new stockings that way. And sometimes they just decide to add fish to a place because people might want something new to catch. I know several years ago, Walker decided to start stocking rainbow trout into one of their lakes. If you want to know why, you'd have to ask Walker.
I know with places like the Vermilion River, I'm a little familiar with just in the south side of the cities, and that was I think a historic trout fishery. And then over time, with agriculture and development and all that stuff, we lost most of that fisheries, I guess. And some of the restocking has occurred there to rebuild that. I mean, there's been a ton of habitat work through the DNR and Trout Unlimited along that stream. So the
Yeah,
restocking of
that's
that stream, it's made it a great fishery again. So
That's definitely some of it too. And the hatcheries down in the southeast will see more of that because I believe some of their Minnesota driftless brook trout are getting stocked back into areas where they were historically, and they're just trying to restart those populations.
yeah. Paul asked a question here about, a lot of the hatcheries that use this coldwater springs and the karst systems. He's wondering about spring protection. I don't think we need to get into it. He's concerned about nitrate levels. There's a great article that just came out in the Star Tribune, I believe, yesterday, um, talking a little bit about that. But
Oh,
um,
as far as the hatchery discharge goes?
no, as protection for the springs that the water comes out of for the hatchery and the nitrate
Oh, I
levels
see.
in the southeast. Um,
I don't know
it's
anything about that
yeah,
anyway.
it's a little bit out of the scope of this talk, but I just happened. I haven't even read the article in the Star Tribune. I just got a link to it this morning, actually. So, um, and that's probably it's a multi-agency approach to our groundwater in the state of Minnesota. So it's a confusing
Sure.
puzzle. Um, so we're gonna pass on that one, or unless you have
For
something to
those
say.
who, well, for those who might be concerned about nitrate levels that we're discharging, because there are a lot of nitrates in our fish feed and stuff, we all have a what is called a NPDES permit, and I can't remember what it's an acronym for, but what it does is every month, at least once, if not twice, we are sending a water sample from our discharge points to the PCA and the Minnesota Agriculture Lab, and they are testing it and making sure that we are within the limits that PCA has established for us to be able to discharge.
Yeah, that's a great point because if you put anything in a bathtub, the water coming out of there is not going to be as
Mm-hmm.
clean as the water going in, right?
Yep.
So, Mark had an interesting question. Oh, it just moved on me. At what altitude are the fish dropped from? Not sure. I'm not a pilot. I wouldn't know that, but
Rumor has it, and this is strictly rumor because I've never seen it, and I know that a lot of times our biologists are not allowed to ride along with because they're concerned about weight. But rumor has it that they are 50 to 100 feet up.
that would make sense.
Yes.
Um, Jacob had a great question about brook trout strains. So can you describe the difference between the brook trout strains found in Lake Superior watershed versus the southeast Minnesota heritage populations? He's also curious if any true native stock still exist within the state, and if not, which strain do you think closely is what strain is most closely original to the native strain?
I actually don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that. I do know that. So if you contacted Desiree Hendrickson in the Duluth area office, she would probably talk to you about it for a long time because she really likes her population up or her populations up there. I do know that they don't stock a lot of brook trout up there. Most of them are either naturally occurring or native. I'm not sure which. And I do know that when we went looking for the Minnesota driftless strain down in the southeast, I believe that there may have been some genetic testing going into that because they were looking for something that was the most native to that area that they could find. If you want more information, though, you'd have to contact the area offices down there because I don't know much about that.
Yeah, because I think originally when people started stocking, and I know that's how rainbow trout and brown trout got here because they're not native
Yes,
to us, to
they are
Minnesota.
not.
But you know, we brought other fish in from other places, and
Mm.
DNA testing, genetic testing wasn't a thing. And now, I just heard that there's actually a little bit of a difference between walleye in southern Minnesota and walleye in northern Minnesota, and how that relates to how they grow and how they survive is an interesting science that we're
Mhm.
still learning a lot about. So.
Yeah, I do know where we've stocked brook trout in lakes or in some of the Duluth streams in the past. Those have, some of them have come from St. Croix Falls because that's where we used to stock them from. Some of them have probably come from whatever the Iron River is raising, which I believe is Tobin Harbor, and I'm not exactly sure where Tobin Harbor is. And they're probably getting the southeast ones right now. I would I would encourage you to contact the Duluth area if you want to know if those are just streams that they're managing for people to have more brook trout opportunities, and if there's native brook trout in other streams that they're not actually stocking on top of. Because I don't know the answer to that.
It's interesting. Well, Jeff put a question here about talking more about trout in the classroom. And when I was doing trout in the classroom, I don't remember working with Meredith too much about it, so I'm not for sure how familiar you are with the program.
My contact with the program is, I believe for a while they were getting eggs from Lanesboro Hatchery. I don't know if they still are anymore. I do know that every year we give a tour to at least 2, if not this year it was 3 busloads of 4th and 5th graders from Bemidji, where they have been raising trout in their classrooms, and they stock those fish in the Clearwater River when they get big enough.
Yeah, it's a very cool program. It's actually a national program. They have salmon in the classroom, in some areas, trout in the classroom. It was started here in Minnesota through a grant through the Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage monies. And Minnesota Trout Unlimited ran that. I ran that program for a few years, and it's still going. I'm not for sure exactly how many schools are in it now, probably in the mid 40s, but if there's any teachers out there, I think it's a fantastic program, obviously, but it's great to, we at the time, Trout in the Classroom was provided equipment, so the school was provided equipment to raise the trout, which comes with an aquarium, and there's a cooler. You actually have to chill your water because trout like that cold water.
Mhm.
So, and then we get eggs to them, and they'd raise those eggs up for the school year. In the spring, they would release them into an approved stream. We have to get them tested by the path lab to make sure there's no, um, Gatorade involved in raising them or something, whatever they test for, any diseases. And then we are allowed to release them into, approved streams in the area. So the kids actually get to go out and scoop their little trout up that are 2 to 3 inches long, depending on how much they fed them, and they get to release them in there. And the goal was to teach not only that life cycle of trout and fish, but also all the water quality stuff that goes on behind it. So they did a lot of research on springs and water quality issues and macroinvertebrates that live in streams and all that fun stuff that kids get to learn. So if
The,
there are,
the kids the kids that come through our hatchery seem to like it.
yeah, they love it. So if it's something you're interested in, reach out to Minnesota Trout Unlimited and see how that program's going, and if there's any teachers out there looking to do that. So Jacob came back with a question on, is some level of stocking tied to stream improvement? For an example, if money is being spent on to improve a stream, does that stream in turn get attention from a stocking standpoint to help those streams recover from a fish standpoint more quickly?
In some cases, probably. In other cases, they may have a really healthy population there that just needs to move around more. Because if you have barriers or some kind of dam, the fish may not be able to get past that and move up and down the stream more. So if they have a healthy population, they may be trying to improve both places for the fish to hide, as far as things like undercut banks and logs and rocks, and also just allow them to move around more. And I do believe that there are places where we have also restocked, as long as the fish were appropriate to go in there to help restart that population as well.
Yeah, and I think just speaking from the Vermilion River experience, there's, even with all the habitat work that's been done there, and I know there was some restocking of browns there at one point, but there's a naturally reproducing brown trout fishery there, but you can't keep them in the Vermilion River because the pressure is just too great being that close to a big metro area. So we do stock a lot of rainbows in the Vermilion River that, people can catch and keep, which is part of fishing, right? People like to catch stuff and bring it home for dinner once in a while. So
That's why we raise steelhead, so that you can. We have our steelhead program is kind of special because we actually clip the little back fatty adipose fin on there, so that people can keep them, because otherwise steelhead on the North Shore is strictly catch and release.
yep, got to protect the wild fisheries when we can.
Yep.
So, and I know there's several streams that I fish that have, brown trout are go, you can keep those what you want, but brookies are immediate release, catch and release only. And I think that's, again, the same thing. They're trying to keep that brook trout strain and keep that population good and healthy that's naturally reproducing, and not mess up the genetics by trying to get different stocking and whatnot.
Mhm.
Or so. All right, Carrie from, well, it says Duluth. Can you describe the activities you perform during a typical workday? Somebody that's maybe interested in a future hatchery position, going to school for,
Ah,
I don't know, is there
well,
a degree? Is there a degree in like hatchery science or?
there is if you go to the Pacific Northwest or possibly the East Coast. But those are the only places that you're getting a specific hatchery degree. I will tell you that a degree in fisheries and wildlife does get you in the door. And eventually, if you are interested in upward movement, the DNR will pay for you to go to a 2-week cold water course that is hosted by the National Fish and Wildlife Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's really, really helpful and really informative because I went through that and I learned a lot. As far as what we do on a daily basis, we, like just about every other fisheries, are kind of seasonal. So right now we are running around like crazy because we have ponds to clean and we have fish that have to get moved, and we're putting a new tank in, which is a side project, but something that needs to be done for preventative maintenance. So that's keeping us busy. And we have a bunch of fish to feed and clean. And then we have stocking coming up once the ice goes out. So spring is kind of crazy for us. During the summer, it's more just maintaining those ponds, cleaning ponds that we're moving fish into, catching up on those preventative maintenance projects like replacing valves and replacing water lines and possibly running new water lines for something that we want to improve. And then in the fall, it's more stocking. It's moving fish from big ponds to other ponds. It's a lot of our fall stocking because we do both lake and then that fly out stocking up in the northeast. And winter is a little bit quieter. A lot of times we'll just be doing little indoor projects for new equipment that we want to build because we build a lot of our own things, or repairs that we want to make on things like pressure washers, or, and I'm not talking the mechanical side of things. I'm talking putting new wheels on the low pressure washer dollies and things like that. And also a lot of people have egg takes in the fall, so they'll be busy with that in the fall. Our egg takes happen during winter, so it's egg takes and then a lot of egg care as well during the winter.
It's a little bit like asking a farmer how, what their day goes like. It changes all the time. It's
A
always
little
something,
bit,
right, that
yeah.
comes up.
I
So
mean, last week we were digging drain lines out of snowbanks because we have to get a pond cleaned.
you do the work that needs to be done. So
Yes, indeed.
uh, Andrew had an interesting question. He's talking about otters. How do you deal with problem otters at hatcheries? But I know there's other birds of prey that like to hang out at hatcheries.
So we have a bunch of different methods. Our ponds have this plastic bird netting. They're about 1-inch squares that goes all around the pond. That helps a lot with keeping the herons and the ospreys out. We also have strings that are overhead on our ponds, so that helps a lot, again, with keeping the birds out. The mink and the otters will pretty much get into anything anywhere they want, and they don't care, which is unfortunate. And so part of it is that we just raise extra fish because of the predation. Part of it is that, like people who have nuisance beavers or nuisance coyotes, we can get a permit from the game wardens, the conservation officers, to trap nuisance otters as necessary. It's not a free for all where we just get to go out and trap all the otters in the stream. It's you can do limited otter sets if you are having a problem.
This was just like the natural world when there's predation that goes on eggs. There's a reason fish have thousands and thousands of eggs.
Yes.
So
And in some
happens in the
places
hatchery too.
they have used chain link, and I think that works a little bit better on the otters, but otters are incredibly resourceful creatures.
They're only fun to watch from a distance until they get into something. So
They're really fun to watch in a marsh back in the woods where they belong and they can't cause problems.
Yes. So, Jacob put a question in here about trout in the classroom be provided for a homeschool environment. I would again have you reach out to Minnesota Trout Unlimited for that. Check into that. And when I was there, we had a couple homeschool groups that did it at, like, Bellwyn was one of them. Dodge Nature Center was one of them. So they used that place as an educational place to bring their homeschool kids and do trout in the classroom through that. So again, Minnesota Trout Unlimited, reach out to them and see if they can help you out and answer your questions. So Meredith, I think that's all the questions I see in the audience. So I think we're good to go. Thank you so much for all your time and your knowledge and sharing everything with us today.
You're welcome.
I know obviously it's close to you because you work at the hatchery, and it's close to a lot of us because we're at the other end on the angling side of it that like to get out there and every once in a while keep some fish to bring home. And it's an important fishery. And I've said it on this program before, and I'll say it again. I think Minnesota is probably the best trout fishing state between the East Coast and the Rocky Mountains. And we're flyover, and it's just fine by a lot of us that live here. So get out and enjoy it. You live in Minnesota, you live in a great state with a lot of outdoor opportunities, and get out and enjoy them when you can. So
My dad plans his boundary water trips around which trout lakes he's going to fish.
I know a lot of people that do that, and I'm actually in the middle of planning one myself. So Michael just put something in the questions here. How do we reach out to Desiree, Northeast Minnesota? She is in the Duluth office, correct?
Duluth area office. Yep. And that's actually, you can find that right on the Minnesota DNR website.
Yep.
The
So
contact
we
information.
put a link in there for the hatchery page. If you go on the Duluth area office up there and reach out to Desiree Holmgren, I believe is her last name.
Hendrickson.
Hendrickson. Okay.
Yep.
Desiree Hendrickson should be happy to help you out and answer some questions, I'm sure. So a couple more thank yous. Thank you, Craig. And I think with that, we can stop the recording and go to the back room. And everybody, we hope to see you next week.